Chair of Politics, Science, and Religion here at the University of Louisville, where I also direct the Center for Asian Democracy. We're really pleased this afternoon to be wrapping up our fall speaker series with a really spectacular presentation. Before we get started, I want to thank especially Emily Rasmussen and Andrew Miners for all their work helping to coordinate these trips, as always, and Anthony Hunley for his work on the tech side of things. For anybody who is live stream online, we will monitor the chat, and during Q&A, you can type in your questions whenever during the talk, and we'll keep an eye on that as we get towards the Q&A portion of our presentation. Digital communication technology is transforming democratic politics across Asia and beyond. Artificial intelligence promises to do more of the same. Combating disinformation, in particular, has gathered international headlines, as well as substantial financial investment from governments, foundations, nonprofits, and even the private sector. And yet, there's still much to learn about both the origins and implications of political disinformation. Like any area of democracy assistance, foreign interventions bring their own risks, and even good intentions don't eliminate these risks. These challenges are particularly apparent in the Philippines, which a Facebook executive infamously called patient zero in electoral fake news and misinformation almost a decade ago, I guess. And the topic has stayed relevant since. We're very fortunate today to have one of the world's leading scholars of disinformation in Asia and beyond to talk about the topic and the lessons it both should and should not teach us today. Jonathan Corpus Ong is professor of global digital media and director of Glotech Lab at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. He completed his PhD in sociology at the University of Cambridge and is now in communication. John is a public intellectual engaged in international policy debates related to disinformation, mediated public participation, and digital humanitarianism. He's the inaugural director of the Global Technology and Social Justice Lab, a creative hub that advances a community-driven model for tech studies and tech justice advocacy that centers on the global majority. His research and advocacy work is centrally concerned with the moral and political consequences of digital media, particularly technological interventions in the context of development, humanitarianism, and media and democracy. He's published 3 books, over 40 articles, dozen policy reports examining the uneven impacts of media interventions for good and technologies advancing democracy. He's passionate about knowledge translation, having co-hosted a digital disinformation whistleblowers podcast, Catch Me If You Can, and launching a community engagement fund that supports academic civil society partnerships for digital literacy interventions in the Philippines and most recently in Brazil as well. His research projects have been funded by leading institutions including the Carnegie Corporation, Gates Foundation, and others. Please join me in welcoming Jonathan Corpus Ong.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much, David, for having me. Thank you for the generous introduction. Thanks also for your flexibility. I know we had to move things around after last week. Thank you to Emily Rasmussen, especially for the hospitality. It's been great to be here so far. So my talk is entitled, What Counter-Disinfo Funding Got Wrong? Lessons from Asia and the Global South. So this is the working title for a paper currently under review. And so I thought it's a good exercise to work through some of its main arguments with you and get feedback. But I'll also be doing a more general introduction of myself and my research program, given that many of you are from different disciplinary background as mine. So I'm trained as a sociologist and my work is highly interdisciplinary. And since 2016 and the elections that brought us Trump, Brexit, and Duterte in the Philippines, most of my work has been in political communication, media and democracy, and disinformation studies. My work has taken me to policy spaces as well, helping shape content policy at Facebook, participating in legislative hearings in the Philippines, cited in documents by Representative Jim Jordan as an example of woke research, and also building research hubs and networks within the academe, within the university, and outside of it. And as I was telling David earlier today, people can have been reading my work in 2 ways, and I think it really does work in 2 registers. So at the first level, my ethnographic work lends itself to people curious at investigating opaque systems and learning how things work behind the scenes and who exactly is responsible for toxic digital campaigns and online content. So at this level, my work is constructive and helps address policy issues, policy debates, designing interventions, and also training of journalists. And at the second level, my ethnographic work is also very much critical of the mainstream of disinformation studies. Its trends of descriptive, overly descriptive research, and also the dominant techno-legal solutions in the tech and democracy space. So in the paper that this talk is based on, my critique is more specifically centered on the unjust systems of knowledge creation and funding mechanisms, specifically in the global tech and democracy space, and hence the title of my talk. So here are my burning questions. Since 2016, my work has been engaged with these three very broad questions. So first, who are the human workers behind digital disinformation operations? Which industries and agencies are actually responsible? So this question examines disinformation as a culture of production, rather than examining it as content or text, and then parse out that problem primarily through definitional battles. Remember, dis, mis, mal, information, and legal terminology, right? So my entry point to doing this kind of work was doing prior research on digital work and precarious work in the Global South. So very much focused on creative labor. And so I bring that lens as well in my study of the digital workers behind the scenes. The second question is, what are the ethics of representing perpetrators as well as audiences of disinformation? What are storytelling tropes that can disrupt stereotypes? So for me, this is a question about the uses of ethnographic methodology and critical frameworks in political communication and tech policy. What might be a more generative way to talk with and talk about the political fans of Duterte in the Philippines, Trump in the US, and globally? What are the perils and also opportunities of humanizing perpetrators and audiences of disinformation? So this speaks to some of my early work on media ethics, and I bring that again to this space. Third, how can we build just and sustainable spaces for community-driven research for and from the Global South, and specifically from Southeast Asia? I've been thinking about this question a lot in my more recent activities of building research hubs in my institution at UMass Amherst, as well as having started an NGO quite recently in the Philippines. So the approach is, if we work in real partnership with civil society leaders, people on the ground, how would our research program and questions be shifted, right? What would be the advocacy frames that we might use? So how would that be different from the mainstream of the tech and democracy space? So that often centers on legislative approaches, combating fake news, or litigation of big tech. That seems to be the mainstream, right? So who would be the people that we would be working with instead? Who are the funders as well that might be interested in this kind of community-driven sociological approach? And how can this work be sustainable in our present context of global aid contraction and the dismantling of international assistance programs? So I hope to discuss these questions with you and work through them with you throughout this talk. So my positionality, my home country is the Philippines. My grad school and early career was in the UK. I've also taught in Hong Kong, but I've been at UMass Amherst for 8 years now. And so my approach to doing global media and tech research is I amplify civil society leaders' visions of tech for good, that they believe would address more meaningfully the needs of their communities. My approach would favor targeted solutions toward specific problems as determined by people in the margins. So following this, I reject tech and platform determinisms in favor of more ethnographic and power-sensitive analysis. So what does this mean? I find narratives and explanatory frameworks of techno-oppression in the usual story of very totalizing, very predictable, top-down, and incomplete ways. I find that I would reject those kinds of frameworks. So, for example, headlines that Facebook has ruined democracies around the world. Citizens have become Pavlov's dogs because of social media, that low-income voters are technologically brainwashed. So I would say that these are emotionally persuasive, explanatory devices, but I find these portrayals also flawed and dangerous. So they're dangerous in the way that they often strip people of agency. And once we dehumanize fellow citizens in this way, we stop seeing each other as conversation partners. So as an ethnographer whose primary collaborators are human rights workers, activists, and everyday citizens in the Global South, I find it essential to give profound significance to people's acts of resistance, endurance, and cunning, and theorize from their meanings of good digital practices, good enough tech policy, and meaningful interventions that can contribute toward a healthier public sphere. So, third point is my foundation for inquiry and movement building is therefore the learned endurance and funds of knowledge of communities in the Global South. And I think there's a way in which our field and political communication in general kind of like always treats Global South countries as case studies, right, to apply theory from the North. So we're going to see whether our theory of populism applies or not. Or in the intervention space, it's about whether something designed in Silicon Valley could be exported to a crisis in the Philippines and then retested somewhere else. So I reject ways of thinking of the Global South as a region of digital dystopia, as just this vast continent of harms, digital harms. I discuss actually existing practices of resisting strongman rule and reimagining democratic participation. And therefore, I find it important to participate in mainstream tech policy spaces, and these are spaces that are often very wide, very quantitative. These spaces in DC, where it's often me who's the only ethnographer or queer or Global South person in the room. And so I take seriously the responsibility to translate knowledge, not often considered legitimate, toward politically plausible solutions and programs. So now just getting to share with you the starting point of my research in this space, my research on disinformation economies in the aftermath of the 2016 elections in the Philippines. So you can see here on screen a few images of online trolls in the global social imaginary after 2016 elections in different countries, US, UK, Philippines, and elsewhere. I think the first image to your upper left is one that you might be most familiar with, the creepy maladapted guy still living in their parents' basement. The second picture below that is a picture of digital sweatshops in the Global South, representing the Global South as this vast source of desperately poor, helpless, mindless click workers who do copy-paste and menial jobs online in often very exotic conditions of poverty. So it often feeds into this trope of the unskilled worker. Another image on the upper right accompanies a Washington Post feature of disinformation in the Philippines, where the Philippines president Duterte was supposedly elected into power in 2016 because of this army of paid online trolls. And the explanatory framework here is the idea of paid trolls brainwashing uneducated masses, and a trope which I critique in my work. So So finally, you have at the bottom right of the screen an editorial cartoon portraying a conversation between a social media public relations manager versus like this online troll, and depicting a clear separation and opposition between the respectable manager and their other. So the main objective of me doing interviews with disinformation producers is really to understand who are these people, where do they come from, what do they look and sound like, what industries do they belong to, what are their job titles, how much do they get paid, and also how do they sleep at night, like what are their moral justifications, do they even aspire to be one of these people, right? So the study Architects of Network Disinformation was published in 2018, and this is a collaborative project written as a public report between me and Jason Cabañas, a professor in the UK, and we pursued this in the wake of Duterte's victory in late 2016. So we started by interviewing politicians, who then introduced us to their campaign consultants, so political marketers. I saw you have a political marketing program, so I find that area interesting. So we asked them how digital campaigns are organized, and that was really the cover story for the research, right? Like we want to understand how are campaigns run in the digital age. So eventually we were able to map out this hierarchy and map out the interrelationships between the politicians, clients at the top, PR managers, influencers, and lower level, what we call community operators. And these are the ones who operate multiple pseudo accounts and infiltrate digital communities. So the key argument of this study is that online trolls, they're not the uneducated, the brainwashed, or low-income voters, as they're often talked about and described in the media. There's in fact a class hierarchy of paid operatives. The public relations strategists at the top, we call them the chief architects of network disinformation. Real and anonymous influencers in the middle, and fake account operators tasked to share and amplify that work. And that's only the paid part, right? Like there's a bottom part here which I had cut for this slide. So people participate and collaborate in disinformation production also across social classes. They fall into this kind of work through various entry points. And often these jobs are even cloaked in respectability. The job title is social media manager, advertising executive, publicist, or legislative staffer. And for all of them, trolling is not a full-time job. It's a side hustle to make ends meet. Nobody also used the word troll to describe themselves. It's always somebody else that they would describe as the real villain and the one who should be held most accountable for online toxic content. So in our paper, we explore and analyze this also through the lens of moral justifications. How do they express this as we're not doing the worst kind of toxic work? So the study also engages with policy debates. We were engaging with the question of, the content takedown approach, which is quite dominant in the tech accountability space. Is that really the only answer when it comes to addressing this entire bureaucracy and collaborative relationships around disinfo production? Also, how can we prevent future people from being recruited into this kind of work? So in chapter 3 of our work, we had written what we call ethnographic portraits, where we retell the story of one person at each level of the hierarchy. And we attempt a thick description of workers' identity, their gender, their social class position, with the aim of producing a kind of estrangement on the reader. So it's not about shock effect and not about inviting harsh judgment about how bad or evil these people are, but actually how relatable and real they are, how human they are, that anybody else could fall into this kind of work. And that's a slow burn kind of horror that we wanted to impart to our readers. So a kind of banality of evil argument that our work was trying to engage with and retell. So the study was published in 2018. It received a great deal of attention. It went viral several times over through multiple election cycles since then. I have testified in the Philippine Senate and Congress in hearings also presided by Senator Amy Marcos. If you know, you know. A global poll of fact checkers by Pointer had voted our study as among the top 5 most useful to journalists and myself among 15 noted researchers. This is an achievement I find gratifying, but also deeply problematic, actually, that the study is the only non-quantitative paper on their list. It's the only Global South paper on that list, and myself as one of the only non-white researchers, too. And I think that speaks to very problematic practices of knowledge creation and sharing in this particular space. So our work was heavily featured in Craig Silverman's investigations for BuzzFeed on disinfo for hire, disinformation for hire, the investigation of public relations firms and different kind of digital marketing enterprises who sell lies online for profit. So without a kind of ideological alignment for their clients, right? So academic impacts of the work include our concept of network disinformation feeding into other concepts such as Kate Starbird's concept of participatory disinformation and participatory propaganda. I find it also meaningful that some scholars in strategic communications also have discussed notions of ethics and justice and how PR practices are complicit to disinformation production. And that's exactly the kind of area that we wanted to participate and bring into the fold in the disinfo discussion space. So the key contribution has been for me to try to engage how to fight fake news beyond this fact-checking approach, right, of judging, is this true or is this false? And about the focus only on disinfo as content and whether should we leave it up or should we take it down? So I'm especially proud of the podcast translation of this research. David had mentioned in the introduction, it's called Catch Me If You Can. This is a collaboration with an investigative journalist, Kat Ventura, who now teaches part-time at the J School in Colombia. So as a whistleblowers podcast, we wanted to interview so-called reformed trolls and former fake account operators, but we had some episodes where we had a current influencer guest on our podcast, and we wanted to again convey, this time not through writing, but actually to hear their voices, to really hit listeners about how real, relatable these people are. They're not like people who are big other capital O, who are like far away, far out in the regions, in strongholds dedicated to Duterte or Marcos or whichever politician. But in fact, they sound like you and me, right? So another aim of this podcast was also movement building, to create and try to create at least a culture of whistleblowing in the country. And we wanted to normalize discussions of ethics and exploitation in the creative industry. So the very first episode was an interview with somebody who got recruited through deceptive means in a public relations firm. So a young person right off of college who thought they would be handling a soft drink brand. And then on the first day of the job, after 3 rounds of interviews, this person finds out, oh, my client is actually the mayor running for re-election. Right? And so to discuss issues of exploitation and how it's so normalized within creative industries. So I also find it important to take you through criticisms we've faced and responded to. So one time I had to go on live television in the country to defend our podcast methodology because we had supposedly platformed disinformers, right? So journalists had come to expect our show to be conducting accountability interviews, bringing receipts to catch influencers. You had lied 3 years ago. Like, we want you to answer to this. So our aim was really to unmask the bureaucracy behind disinformation and critique the bigger system that has normalized and incentivized it. And so doing this kind of engaged research also in the public sphere, I've come to learn how it's important to respond to these public criticisms and also work through those ideological and methodological differences, even if you're within the same camp. And in that specific case, I didn't apologize. I defended the core values of the work while also learning lessons on how to be more mindful, working with allies who apply different methodologies and who come to bear expectations. There's also learnings there for those of you who do a lot of public communications around how to promote academic work in the public sphere. And I think like the promotional language is something that we need to be also very conscious of when we go out there and participate in these discussions. Okay, so now I shift to the more network building component, which is much more directly related to the paper I'm currently writing. So in the past years, my work has not just been focused on doing the actual research, but on movement building and organizing and trying to learn also and draw connections with colleagues who are doing work, similar work as I do in other countries. And that's brought me to Brazil many times over the past 2 years. So I think it's important for me to engage with the question of what does tech justice look like for and from the Global South? And when does that vision and sense of advocacy, when would that diverge from the Global North priority? And that has been the key question of my work. So in 2022, I launched a South-to-South knowledge exchange project in the aftermath of elections in Brazil, as well as in the Philippines. So both countries experienced elections at the same time. That was when Bolsonaro got defeated narrowly by Lula, and the Philippines had elected the son of former dictator Ferdinand Marcos as president. And so we felt that we had a lot to learn from colleagues in Brazil. What interventions did they do that we could perhaps learn for future electoral cycles? So there's also longer histories that we could compare. So there's shared experiences of dictatorship in the 70s in both countries, democratic innovations and resistance as well in the present. So both countries are seen or at least framed as leading movement building in tech justice advocacy in Latin America and Southeast Asia, respectively. So since then, we had broadened out our network building to include, as you can see in this graph right here, colleagues also from India, South Africa, Indonesia, Kenya, for a more global conversation. We have hosted several events online, but also in Brazil, the US, and the Philippines, to bring policymakers and civil society leaders. So this image right here are Brazilian government ministers who were explaining to a very international audience their justifications for some of the aggressive content takedowns that they had applied prior to the 2022 election in Brazil. And what we found, one key learning from that convening was how South-to-South conversations is not just about agreement, but making space for disagreement and hashing out like some of those different strategies among different countries and specialists. So I recall how tech activists from India and Southeast Asia were disagreeing with the Brazilian government ministers cautioning their hasty celebration, given, of course, India's experience under Modi, Southeast Asian civil society's experiences of being targeted by anti-fake news legislation. They were quite hesitant and unconvinced about the Brazilian approach. So for me, this kind of South-to-South research or comparative work is a good model of anti-colonial practice in the tech policy space. We'd like to think that some of our engagements, working also with donors, help redirect funding towards supporting grassroots organizations who had previously been excluded from these coalitions, which often are just about fact-checking or litigation of big tech. So one key output from this project is a study custom built, translated to Portuguese as Fecha Sob Medida, Reforming Tech and Democracy Programs for the Global Majority. And this is really an audit of how Global South civil society leaders have experienced doing counter-disinformation work and tech and democracy work. So its general argument is what you can see on screen. Global South civil society fare well only when they are aligned with Western donors' agenda. So those smaller groups, and they tend to be more grassroots, community organized, not legacy media. So more community media types. Those who would advocate for more specific needs of oppressed communities in country through more hyper-local approaches, more like community conversation kind of approaches. Those are the ones that struggle to keep their doors open. And they shouldn't have to, right? So our what we wanted to do is through this study is to give it back to donors to say, so these are the things that you are not looking at and need to support more. So our study retells examples of when Global South are at odds with Global North pro-democracy agenda. So like when we talk about what is like a pro-democracy intervention, right? Like, that would be like promoting elections, supporting fact-checking, good governance kinds of approaches within country. But through interviewing civil society leaders around the world, for example, like those in Myanmar would say, actually our advocacy is for Facebook not to promote like what is likely a fraudulent election, right? So those are the kinds of things that we wanted to focus in this work. So supporting an anti-colonial approach in tech and democracy is about building more just and non-extractive spaces as well for collaboration in which Global South participants can determine priorities and design more customized responses, and hence the title Custom Built, and hence the cover art drawn, illustrated by a Korean artist, Yanni Kim, which is about like handcraftsy lanterns, right, in the process of being repaired. And obviously on one hand as objects of illumination, but also we wanted to keep that handcrafty element to it as well, to illustrate that argument. So just some more examples that that emerge from this study and relating to the idea of what counter disinfo funding, what the tech and democracy space has done wrong. So one is about redirected organizational mandates in the challenge of riding funding waves ethically. Like, how does one even do that? Is there an ethical way of doing this? So one, there's the theme around temporality and how funding cycles are often tied to election cycles. So parachute researchers, election season, funding cycles sometimes lead to a dramatic redirection of organizational mandates. So examples include grassroots youth groups who are really highly skilled in mobilizing young people, young leaders, training them toward good governance. because the funding within the disinfo space has really redirected priorities, they now retrain themselves to become fact checkers, to obtain funding on a per article basis. So, and then once that, once that pot is gone after the election, they go back to doing their kind of work. So there's a duplication of interventions. Some organizations evolve their digital democracy portfolios in more sustainable ways than others. Those organizations who enlisted in coalitions to simply test and apply tools during elections seem to fare weaker. And of course, in our work, we don't have like a blanket normative judgment that this is all good or this is all bad. Some organizations do need to beef up their communications capacity and tech and upskill when it comes to participating in monitoring digital environments as well. So, so finally, and this is like my last substantive argumentative slide, the critique of colonialism in tech policy and advocacy is something that we include in that study, and we want to elaborate on in greater detail in the journal article. And the key question here is, how are different global South countries' tech policy and advocacy frames, how are they aligned or non-aligned with Western governments' foreign policy agenda? And for me, this is where South to South and comparative research really helped me understand in much more tangible terms those differences with the Philippines and other countries. So conversations between Filipino and Brazilian researchers, for me, I was struck by how much we were so clearly aligned with the U.S. securitization and militarization agenda as compared with Brazil. So the Philippines is a former colony of the U.S. and more closely aligned with a mainstream liberal democratic communication model. So a model that would treat disinformation as a bug in the public sphere. And the question in the puzzle here is often framed as, how can we get our citizens to trust the media again, or to trust gatekeepers of knowledge in academia again, right? And the alternative and more critical perspective, which I subscribe to, is that citizens, especially the disenfranchised, have never really felt seen or represented or welcomed in those spaces. And so disinformation is not a bug, it is a feature in a corporatized public sphere that protects the political and economic interests of billionaires and landowners. So our study critiques complicity, and complicity is one of the key terms that we use, in how certain advocates would be much more aligned with a frame of fighting foreign interference from Brazil and Russia, and how that has redirected otherwise critical scholars to hunting foreign interference, right? In contrast, we encountered more resistance from Brazilian tech advocates who said, hunting Russian propaganda, it's a war that doesn't deal with our problems. It is a priority, but it's probably 73rd down my list. Complicity also in tech advocacy frames between Maria Ressa, Nobel Peace Prize laureate, who would also echo some of the platform determinism that we often hear about from also other in the American liberal democracy discourse, repeating sometimes this dumb voter trope and the brainwashed voter trope. So in my work, I critique this insofar as it also alienates the very people that we're trying to win over to our side. So I learned a lot from Brazilian researchers and journalists who say how they're very sensitive not to frame digital literacy interventions with potentially anti-poor sentiments. And finally, I work a lot with Southeast Asian civil society leaders, and I very much aligned with their advocacy frames that challenge this very legal approach to fighting fake news, and how there's a group of civil society leaders from Southeast Asia who came together under the umbrella of Pushback UNESCO in 2023. They were challenging UNESCO as, in a way, endorsing a kind of legal approach to fighting disinformation, which they think would rubber stamp domestic overregulation and fail to anticipate harms to activists and dissenters in country. Okay, so for my final slides, really they're an invitation to connect and to collaborate and strategize around the sustainability of spaces that we need to preserve to continue doing critical research, also in this context of educational authoritarianism. So at GlowTech Lab, we're a collective of 5 professors and 7 graduate students, and we wanted to create a container for a globally minded approach to tech studies, which we think is still not as global and still very much framed with Silicon Valley and big tech in mind. So I think it's important to continue having this kind of global framework within this tech policy space. And as mentioned, I recently, so SIGLA is celebrating 1 year as an NGO in the Philippines. It's a nonprofit for action research aiming for healthier public spheres. It's a space for mentoring, healing, burnout recovery, and convivial exchange among members and partners. So a lot of our of the very young staff of SIGLA are like former and retired like human rights workers, journalists, and those who have burnt out from doing a lot of on-ground organizing. And so we maintain a Disinfo hub, which contains educational resources on open access, and also pursue projects on worker justice and artificial intelligence. So I would like to end with that, and I look forward to learn more about your work and learn more about priorities within your center as well. Thank you.
All right, thanks very much, John. So, excuse me, we'll take questions now. I can get us started, and then we'll pass the mic around as we go. Also, I'm wondering, John, if you talked mostly about the supply side, I think, of the disinformation economy, and I'm curious how you and your work see practices related to the demand side, and sort of the activists who you interview and the networks that you're trying to build. How do you engage that side of the equation?
Great. Yeah, so thinking about the producers and also people who would resonate with disinformation content and particular narratives. Yeah, so Nicole Corato, a dear colleague and collaborator, also a co-author of some of the election-related policy reports that we have produced, really, I think captures it very well, right? Like how Duterte, and leaders such as Marcos really taps into anti-elite sentiments in the Philippines and marshals various strategies to perform themselves as anti-establishment. And I think you could really see how that main broad message is very much tailor-fit and targeted to diverse communities, whether around age or around region in the country. And that's how the disinformation hierarchy, the architecture that we had been able to map out, that's what we thought they were exactly doing. So their selection of influencers, their selection of meme accounts. So these are not like, like these are not, some of these accounts, you don't know who operates them, but they target specific humor, knowledgeable to specific communities in an if you know kind of basis, but still organized around that kind of anti-elite, anti-establishment message. And I think that's what really has resonated with a lot of voters. Another key tidbit about Philippines and Philippine voters, so especially in a transnational context, along with Vietnamese Americans, Filipino Americans are the Asian American group that's most likely to vote Republican. And that's also been a puzzle that has captivated a lot of researchers, including in the diaspora. So I think there's a lot of resonance. Your work on religion, I find is also fascinating to think through how religious expressions are also part of that messaging and ways of mobilizing people.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Hassan, a doctoral research fellow here. Thank you very much for this talk. It was amazing. So I came up with 5 research paper ideas. I just want to bounce one with you. So I wonder what was your finding about the so-called reform trolls that you mentioned when you covered them? Because the Philippines has very competitive elections. And when we think about democracy and non-democracy, the Philippines is usually a democracy. So, and the idea here is that I wonder how those troll factories have spillover effects, because obviously rich countries, metropoles, former metropoles, recruit in former colonies because they speak the language, they have better public education. The Philippines owes very strong public education system to, in part, to the colonial experiences that they had. And in a way that it happens is that, so, okay, this kind of follows the established trend. But then I wonder, what are the spillover effects from those operations of the troll factories to the elections within the Philippines themselves, if they actually increase or decrease trust in elections? Because my suspicion is that if you could give us just a little bit more in terms of numbers, like what is the like number of people who are involved in like such works? And I presume they would be located in urban areas with strong internet and so on. So I would be very curious to learn about that. Thank you.
Yeah, really good question. So my work is not does not attempt at quantitative and like numerical, like big picture mapping of trends, but having spoken with quite a number, and they were open to me over 2 election cycles. It was only after a second election cycle that some of these PR strategists and political consultants who have stopped returning my calls for like follow-up interviews, right? But the theme really has been normalization, and also just the idea as well of it's so everyone is doing it, we have to get on board. And so this is a sentiment that is not just about Duterte and Marcos and their supporters or their parties, but it also cuts across. So even with politicians who are deemed like the more liberal and more the good guys, you would hear some of their campaigners say, we are also operating to do the same work. We have to fight fire with fire. So that's one of the key terms that came out in our 2022 follow-up study about how fighting fire with fire means investing in these kinds of black operations, not just at national level, but also at local level. So even the mayor, even the council person is having to get on board. Their operations would vary. Some are still quite professionalized in that they would outsource it to a digital marketing consultancy firm who have done this with other clients at national or local levels. Some try to reproduce it in-house. And so these different kinds of work models are also becoming much more flexible in that way, which again, is so concerning, right? Like the fake account operator doesn't have to be the professional person being paid, but it's an added workload for the new recruit within the team, within the legislative staff team, for example. So it becomes like added work is exploitative labor, right? Like someone thinks that they're a legislative staffer, but they also have to do it on the side when it comes to an election cycle. So I hope that answers your question. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Adam Enders. I'm a professor in the political science department. First, thanks for your talk. It's super interesting. I have a question sort of going back to the demand side, but somewhat related to Dave's. So you talked about how there are sort of these kind of three rough tiers of supply side, excuse me. There are these sort of three rough tiers, and the folks in that lowest tier, they tend to think of this as just sort of a job. It's not really like an ideological pursuit. It's not a political pursuit more broadly. I wonder if there's something kind of epistemological going on there, though. So maybe they're not really thinking about this in terms of being unethical or not even just thinking about like the ethical nature of doing this, whatsoever. But maybe there's something epistemologically, like not in the sense of being epistemologically like vicious, right? Like dogmatism or intolerance or gullibility or something like that. But sort of more of a generalized sort of like distrust of epistemic authority figures and the sort of melees about just this whole idea of separating fact from fiction and truth. So it's just sort of like,
I love that.
It's just sort of relative and like, why should we even really care about this? Because it's all just such a mess. And so like, yes, I have to pay bills, right? But also I have to pay bills and I just sort of like don't care about this, right? Like there's no really solving this. So it's kind of this sort of loose conditional factor that like makes material reality and like satisfying those needs a lot easier.
I love that. Yeah. Thank you. I rarely get questions that delve more into like psychology and also the like moral characters of workers. And it's often like, how do we hunt them down, right? So thank you for the question, Adam. So I find it's among the influencers who are the more immoral ones, particularly like the more anonymous influencers who are those really skilled at messaging, like so I've met like one person who operates 6 meme accounts, and meme accounts of 100K followers each. And each meme account has a different personality. One is like positive quotes, another one is like snarky bitch humor, right? But it's one person doing it. And within that, there's that, it's not hitting them. Like I'm trying to ask, so yeah, how are you doing? Do you tell other people about your work? Yeah, it's just a job for me. In fact, I'm so excited to go on another, to get another client. And so that kind of like fame getting into their head, I found that kind of persona among the influencer kind. Obviously, the key opinion leader influencers. So yeah, that like a equivalent of like Candace Owens, Ben Shapiro's stuff. Yeah, there's more alignment between what they say, I guess, and the people they vote for and support for. But the immoral ones tend to be the anonymous influencers. Among here, and these I guess speak to their class position and their precarity. Like this is I have met people recruited into this work through deceptive means multiple times, and some had even brought like a friend to an interview context because I could feel that it was they haven't spoken to it with anybody else but that person, and they needed someone to hold their hand through what they felt was like a very shameful period of their life. So that was something that really struck me, that for some who had actually engaged with it, it was something that is still something that they were working through in an almost kind of like therapeutic retelling of what they were trying to do. And they were signing up to be a respondent was their way to also like, okay, I hope it helps. Yeah, helps the fight. Yeah, but thanks for that wonderful question.
Oh. Oh. Okay. Hi, so I'm Savannah. I'm a professor in the English department. And I wanted to go back to one of the earlier slides and ask a couple of questions about narrative.
Okay.
So,
Like this one?
yeah. So what I'm really interested in is not just the way in which like narratives that we tell ourselves about like, oh, people who troll must be uneducated. So one, how does this narrative spread? Who benefits from spreading this narrative? But also relating it back to the ways in which like a lot of people have been surprised about the ways in which like diasporic Vietnamese and Filipino Americans have voted more Republican in the past years, which really isn't that surprising. How can we kind of like think about the ways in which narratives or rhetorical strategies are kind of responsible for the ways in which we talk about like things? So I was hoping to just kind of like hear more about that and like your take on the kind of like more human element of the stories that we tell ourselves and the stories that people who work these jobs and do these forms of labor would tell themselves so that they can maybe distance themselves from what seemingly would be like quite a bit of like emotional labor.
Okay. I think I think I got the first half of the question or the first question, and we can pause and do that first before I ask for more detail about the second question. Yeah, I think so with my work as an ethnographer within a space which is much more administrative research heavily driven, right? Like what's the solution? What's our policy approach? What's the best way to do it? For me, like the storytelling angle was something that I was really invested in, right? Like what can ethnography do and offer a space that is wanting like quick solutions around which stuff should we take down? Who should we ban online? Like which are the people that, like even the word or the concept of bad actor, like the social media bad actor, right? It became so popular in the past years. And as someone who's tried to always kind of like try to make room for really understanding people's motivations, their cunning, people are complex, I found that important to still preserve in that work. For me, other scholars who are doing this kind of more community-driven kind of approach include Rachel Kuo. I think she's in Wisconsin-Madison now. You can double check with that. And her work has also been about doing interviews intergenerationally among Korean Americans. And so around themes around politics. And so there's one paper in a special issue that I co-edited for the International Journal of Communication. The special issue is entitled True Costs of Misinformation. And it was a methodological reflection of how does one get our elders, Asian American elders, to talk about politics in a way that's also non-judgmental and non-like, oh, you're awful, right? Like, so what are other ways of doing this? And I think other scholars like Nicole Corato in the Philippines, again, a dear friend and colleague, her approach is via the lens of deliberative democracy. And so, which means inviting people across different regions, different social classes to debate like a social problem and to produce a community solution that is most people, the majority, would get behind, right? So I'm interested in that kind of grassroots community approach, which funders do not really care for, right? Like they care for something that's scalable, something that could be exported from one region to another, like context agnostic approaches. And I think the producing work that I have is trying to convince them that no, you should invest in these longer term but very more expensive solutions because you need time, you need linguistic expertise and cultural specificity and knowledge, right, to be able to do this kind of work.
I'm K.A. Owens. I have a bachelor's degree in communications from this university and a master's in humanities from this university. Also, I'm continuing studies now in communication and art. So there's a concept that I don't know whether it's original with me or not, but a concept that I refer to as aspirational whiteness. And so as far as voting patterns of people in South Asia and motivations, is there still a desire out there to sort of match up to a white standard, and that's driving and influencing so many of the things? I see a lot of over here in the States. I still see a tremendous amount of aspirational whiteness in various communities. So the desperate desire to match up to a white standard. So is that having an effect in your opinion?
Yeah, I think your question speaks more about Asian American communities, Filipino American communities, and I think my statement that among Asian American communities at large who tend to actually vote blue, but with the exception of two groups, Vietnamese and Filipino Americans. And I think, yeah, there's definitely long histories and different waves of migration that, yeah, of Filipinos to the U.S. and descriptions around assimilationist strategies that Filipinos had to perform and had to practice just to blend in and not to rock the boat, right? And I think that certainly there's a lot of resonances, religion being one of them, of how certain narratives, certain value systems, expectations around gender norms as well could be doubly reinforced from home country to host country. And other colleagues have written about this work as well. Yeah, but the proximity to whiteness is something that has been discussed as something that can partially explain some of these strategies.
For maybe one more. All right, I'll ask one more. Okay. So your work, John, reminds me a little bit of some of the scholarship on vote buying, including in the Philippines, right? And in particular, the ways in which interventions that are designed to sort of stop vote buying, right, can sometimes misunderstand the moral economy around vote buying and what are the poor actually doing and how this isn't as simple as just buying off sort of stupid poor people. There's something more nuanced going on here, right? And the way you talk about disinformation reminds me of some of that work. And in some of that work, there's this argument that vote buying actually does have a kind of positive, that there's a moral project behind it that is about a certain kind of community accountability or community engagement, right? That like there's some moral purpose within a community being served by vote buying. It might be problematic, but there is a kind of community thing. It's not just about I'm going to get my own individualism, right? Like, is there anything like that going? Like, what good does disinformation do to a community?
That's so good. Yeah.
It's clear that it's good for somebody to pay the bills in a precarious situation in urban Manila. Sure, right? It's like, you got to make a buck. Okay, that's fine. But is there a sense that you get that there's actually sort of a deeper community logic to this, or is it just about individualism?
That's such a great question. I didn't expect that was a follow-up question from your first remarks, which is really cool. I love to be surprised. Certainly, like the vote buying literature. The question of like what's the effects or outcomes of disinformation is always a journalist's question, right? And I will always revert to disinfo is a communication strategy, but it's not a mobilization strategy, at least for the most part. There are some elements to it, especially here in the U.S., which is like very mobilization directed, which is scarier than getting people to vote, right? And so like the thinking about campaigning, messaging, branding as just the air war kind of approach, like in political marketing, and then the ground war of getting people out there. And that's where the vote buying component is still so central, especially to how elections are run, especially for local races, more than the national races. So I think for me, like the disinformation campaigns and branding definitely work so much more effectively in a way, or have broader reach at national level races than the local races. That's That would be my argument for the Philippine context. But your actual question is about like what are the unexpected, cunning uses of, right, of like bad content, right? Which is yeah, like the parallel that you draw with vote buying that some scholars, including Fred Schaffer, has written about. So I think yeah, that's a fascinating question. So I align with and agree with scholars such as Francesca Tripodi, who see conspiracy theorists, disinformation purveyors as smart people rather than dumb people who had been hoodwinked or brainwashed, especially those who participate in doing your research and in this kind of rabbit hole. There's an element of critiquing establishment thinking, establishment institutions, and a new alternative epistemology and way of building knowledge comes out there. So I think, and connecting it back to one of the questions earlier, the importance of not treating ordinary people who resonate with such messages, not to close the conversation, but to continue to be curious about the roots around that. I think that's what I find important to look at in this particular space. Yeah, so I hope like people are able to use this kind of knowledge creation to also continue to be curious and at the same time see it as just like one phase of their life perhaps, and maybe it is still possible to reform and change and realign one's orientation down the road.
All right, well, maybe you can join me in thanking Jonathan Corpus Ong one more time for being here. And I think I'm grabbing the right thing back here. Just a few small tokens of our gratitude, John. So again, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for your questions.
Bag of
It's so cool. Yeah, thank you.
Not vote buying though. All right. Thanks to everyone here in person and online. We're wrapping up for the semester now as we get into Thanksgiving soon and then the holiday season. But we'll be right back at it in mid-January. So keep an eye on CAD's newly launching website refresh, hopefully soon, as well as social media accounts and join our email listserv for our spring semester speaker series, which will kick off with Diana Kim from Georgetown University in mid-January. So until then, see you next time.